Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session today. I'm joined here by Vince, Christina, and Pauline, and we have a really exciting session today to talk about. We're dubbing it or calling it sales comp horror stories, and so we have a few different scenarios, exercises that we've kind of arranged through a lot of different kind of anonymous submissions, but also just experience on our own behalf, and wanted to talk through with our guests today and kind of go through what people have encountered and ways that they have solved and fixed some of these issues that we'll discuss. And so I'll start off by just introducing myself and then hand it over to our guest today. So my name is David Girardi. I'm VP of Customer Operations here at Forma, leading the incentive comp design and administration for all of our customers. And I have around 13, 14 years in experience in this space, working with close to 50 different customers at this point on the design of their comp plans. And so maybe I'll hand it over to Christina to start with.
Yeah, thanks, David. So nice to talk to everybody today. Yes, I am currently with Cisco leading the compensation design and implementation for the specialist organization for two of their architectures. I have around 10 years of experience in sales compensation at various companies in the RTP area and look forward to the conversation today.
Great. And Vince?
Thank you everyone for joining today. Vince DeCasa, Director of Global Sales Compensation at Databricks. Been in the space about 14 years and have worn multiple hats from admin, manager, vendor, strategy consultant, third-party consultant, and current director level. Looking forward to having a conversation with my peers here and for those in the audience as well.
Great. And Pauline?
Hi, nice meeting everyone here. And I am Pauline, and I'm with Unity Technologies. My main responsibilities are compensation plan, strategy, design, and policy. So Vincent must be older than me. He had a 14 years experience. I had probably 13.
Great. And again, thanks for joining us today. And I will now share my screen and we'll walk through some of the topics that we had today. So each one of these slides, we're kind of going to walk through a theoretical situation that is kind of masked from different things that we've encountered, as I mentioned before. And so we'll start off the session today with a couple different scenarios around the theme of sell at all costs. And so this is kind of when short-term incentives drive unintended consequences. So the situation we have here is a company has a product they want to promote, and customer awareness of the product is low and requires a high degree of education and effort from sales to increase adoption. So what this company did was they took the comp plan, they rebuilt it to allocate quite a significant amount of weighting in terms of the OTE for the reps. They allocated 30% to a quota and incentive for this performance group alone, with additional kickers for overperformance. And so as a result, they obviously adjusted OTEs for the other products in their bag accordingly. And the outcome for this was they got what they wanted in one sense, that they achieved a threefold increase in sales for the targeted product, but it caused a decline in core product sales, which represent a significant amount of the company's annual revenue. And so the questions that I wanted to ask the three of you is, how can companies balance these aggressive targets with sustainable growth? And what have you found effective to promote a healthy sales culture in terms of balancing multiple objectives at once?
So I'm able to start the conversation. Thank you, David. So this was interesting when I read this before. Very early on in my career, I had a similar type of situation actually occurred here, where there was what I would call like a low-hanging type fruit or a newer product that came into the comp plan and design. And what we saw unfold within the fiscal year was that our sales representative would focus on kind of that easy sell, blew out their quota for the entire fiscal year, and they did not focus on, like in this particular situation, the core product, right? So like any time in a sales comp program, it's important to kind of look at lessons learned, have your continuous kind of planning process for your next fiscal year. And what we did in this particular situation, and I think my fellow panelists will get into the questions here too, is we actually implemented a hurdle for the following fiscal year, so that we wanted folks to really focus on kind of new products, but also focus on a core product as well, right? Because that's kind of the longer term initiative for the company and strategy at that time there. And so the following fiscal year, actually, we kind of had a lesson learned in this particular scenario, and that we did see a better balance within the selling, right? And ultimately, that's what we want to make sure we do, to focus on kind of the various company strategies and initiatives there. So I don't know, Christina, Pauline, if you had any other comments.
Yeah, Christina, maybe we'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great call out, Vince, right? Like when I see this, that's the first thing I think of, is some sort of hurdle in place that you still are leveraging your new product, but you're still showing that the rest of your product portfolio is equally as important, right? Like while we do want to focus on this specific place, we don't want to lose line of sight on the rest of what's important to our business. With that said, some other options you could look at is, maybe building it into your core plan is not the right fit for your business. One thing you could look at potentially is some sort of, additional accelerator or modifier type situation on that product, right? So while it's not gated, it does offer some sort of additional incentive, not necessarily a spiff per se, but along those lines, it could be built into the comp plan that would give an additional percentage or multiplier, whatever that looks like within their compensation when that product is sold. You could put some protective measures that kicks in at a certain level of attainment or whatever, if you're trying to balance as well cost between motivation and what you're communicating to the field. So those are some things that come to mind for me of different ways that you could do this, but not lose focus on the rest of your portfolio.
Right. And Vince, just so Christina, the point about spiff, the excellent one, or spiff-like, as you kind of put it. But Vince, just to be clear for the broader group as well, when you say hurdle, the way that would actually look like in practice is what?
Yeah, so if you have product A and product B, the intent would be to sell enough of product A before you start to get paid on commissions for product B, right? So you're kind of forcing the hand a little bit of the payee to be more well-rounded and not just game the system, right? And that could be, various different slice and dice approach to that, but simplistically, that's what it is.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen that in my practice too. You have to hit a minimum of, let's say, 75% on product A until the kicker for product B is unlocked, or commission rate for product B is unlocked to a certain degree. So yeah, I think that is a reasonably common approach as well. Pauline, I'm not sure if you had any thoughts here to weigh in.
Yeah, I agree with Vince and Christina. So when I design the plan, if we have a product initiative, I probably will consider plan component weightings, but I will not go above what we try to shoot for. If it's 25%, I will not go 30% component weighting or 40%, etc. So yesterday we had a session. We talked about not to be afraid of complexity to a certain extent, right? So we like Vince and Christina mentioned, like there are other ways, like a gate, a minimum component attainment for the new product to be served as a gate to allow as a accelerator to kick in. Let's say, okay, your 75% component hit 100% quota target, but I will, at a minimum, your 25% has reached, let's say, 75%. I'll let the accelerator to kick in. So it serves as a gate. It does add complexity, but it does serve purpose to make sure reps are not trying to only sell the core products, which is easier to sell, and the new products might take more, effort. So, or you can do a different accelerator, but not to like extreme, to ensure high risk, high reward. So spiff is always a hot topic. Some companies have no budget for spiff. Some companies like, we are super, hyper growth company. We can do spiff without any budget. So it comes down to the company, principle. But, it is a good way to incentivize a new product, a new initiative, the key is just we want to make sure how much we are spending, what kind of results we want to see, and then what's the effectiveness, and that homework and afterwards evaluation is important, serves a purpose to let us know, okay,
Right.
yeah, this really worked, or in the future we should do it in a different way or whatever. So it's a good exercise to think about as well.
Right, and I think the key word they use there is the complexity cannot be overstated. I mean that essentially the drawback that I've seen in this kind of hurdle approach is that it can sometimes get complicated to explain to a rep. And I'm sure, as we all know in our experiences, one of the most important things is, can a rep clearly explain the comp plan back to you? Can they calculate their earnings to the exact cent on their own? And when you start, especially in multi-product bags, let's say someone's carrying 4 different products, it does sort of get complicated, because essentially what I've also seen in my experience is that the hurdle design is obviously selected based on, probably some financial scenarios that you're running before rolling out the plan. And so they might not be very nice rounded numbers. It could be, 75% on product 1, 80% on product 2. And so it will add complication, but again, it is a good way to mitigate against this risk. The SPIF route is also what I think very a lot simpler, perhaps, for the reps to understand, and can achieve the exact same results. So both very good options, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I think, this is what compensation team can do, right? It's not just a plan strategy design. It also comes down to enablement, to education. You can create commission estimator to show the rep how you actually populate in your deal, your data, and how, you can reach your quota and also accelerate. So some kind of help education will be very useful.
Yes, great point.
Yeah. And I'll just add one other note, David, on this one is I think whatever strategy the business picks also depends on the product, right? If it's a new product, and do you have a reasonable historical data to establish some sort of guideline, right? To put that hurdle, like at what percent attainment would that kick in? If it's a brand new product and you don't have that historical data, then maybe a SPIF is the right fit, because it's hard to assign a numerical, goal to something like that. So it really depends on the life of the product. Is it new? Is it existing? What does that year-over-year data look like? And are we comfortable enough building that in our comp plan or not at this point? So I think there's a lot of factors that go into it, but there are a couple of different ways to try to mitigate and control overspend as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's hard to see where the comp plan needs guardrails until you've seen people veer off the road, right? So I think that's an excellent point. Why don't we move on to the second scenario? Still the similar theme of sell at all cost. So I'll set up this situation here. So it's a company that's facing stagnating sales despite having a product suite that's very competitive and loved. The incentive structure hasn't been changed in several years, and it paid reps based on a book of business that they built up. So the result was the reps became very comfortable and weren't incentivized to grow. So what management did is they decided to revamp the plan, allocate majority of the variable pay towards growth. So that would be existing and net new. And they rolled out the plan. And what they ended up seeing after year 1 was net new and existing customer sales grew. But the drawback was many customers reporting feeling pressured, and ultimately led to an increase in returns and support requests. And so the question for the group is, how can companies better balance aggressive sales targets with sustainable growth? And what strategies have you found effective in promoting a healthy sales culture?
Yeah, so I think my first comment on this one, David, kind of putting on the ex-consultant hat is, to me, it was a red flag if a company has not touched their program for several years, right? I think from an admin perspective, we would probably love that, right? But from a evolving competition, you're always going to be left behind, right? So I think no matter what within the sales comp program, you want to continue to enhance, evolve, continuously improve on that, right? There's always something from one year to the next. The marketplace changes, the economy changes, right? There's a lot of different variables are taking effect there. The other piece too, when you're looking at the comp plan design and, how do you kind of promote a healthy sales culture? In multiple industries, if not all, I'm a big advocate of, how can a sales rep or payee be that strategic growth partner with their book of business and customer, right? So us on kind of the back end operational design of that, how do we set them up for success to cultivate that relationship and grow their client and book of business strategically and not forcefully, right? It's a fine line to kind of thread in that, but once you kind of get to that point there, I think then you can really focus on not just that short-term gain, maybe that 1 year and everyone hits out of the park, but how do you really drive that lifetime customer value or your book of business?
Yeah, and I can jump in there to kind of piggyback on Ben. So I think those are great points, right? When looking at this, a couple of questions kind of come into play, right? With the scenario here, like, are we talking a true hunting sales organization? Is there a renewals team that like harbors their existing customers, right? Because the perspective here is the customers felt very pressured to buy new products and maybe that they weren't valued as an existing just kind of baseline customer, even though they are, right? Like that renewal base is important to the longevity of the customer. So we want to ensure, like, I think, Vince, what you were maybe getting at is like an enablement, right? Like we need to have an enablement rollout plan to the sellers of shining light on what is the bigger picture of the organization. We want to grow business. We want to focus on net new, but we also want to meet our customers where they are, right? And not make them feel pressured. So let's look for those opportunities where we as a comp team and a strategy team can help support our sellers to help meet their goals, but also harbor our baseline customers and support them. That way we're kind of in it for the long game, right? When they're ready to buy new products, we'll be there and we want to do that, but we don't want to do that at the stake of our existing business. So I think this is a meet in the middle between our enablement teams, our comp plan, and making sure we have the right team set up to support that, right? If these sellers are owning everything from renewals to net new, then that is a delicate balance, right? Like maybe you measure this with a couple of different elements to their comp plan, different weightings. Maybe the net new business is weighted heavier than the renewal business. Maybe the net new business has a higher accelerator on it than the renewal business, right? There are ways to motivate it, but there's still stake in the game to harbor the existing baseline relationships with our customers that maybe aren't quite ready to add new products or grow from where they're at.
That's a great point. And I feel like when I also read this scenario, my immediate thinking was, again, maybe in defense of all of my work being done in comp plan design, is that I almost get defensive of the comp plan and saying not everything can be solved by the comp plan. So while yes, this did result in some negative outcomes for the customers, perhaps there wasn't enough done to properly train, properly roll out the complementary part of the comp plan, so that the reps are actually doing and saying the things that the company wants, and then backing it up with a comp plan that incentivizes that behavior that you're driving them towards. So I think it's those two pieces together. And not always the kind of the root of the problem necessarily points back to the comp plan, although certainly in some cases it definitely does. One thing I wanted to ask kind of the group on this one that hit me in reading the last sentence in terms of the support requests and perhaps customer happiness is, have any of you in your experience seen customer satisfaction metrics put into the comp plan? So what reps OTE weight actually put against something like an NPS score or some sort of customer sat score?
Yeah, we did in the past, and the result, I will not say it's very optimal, because there will be a lot of edge cases and a lot dispute. Oh, my customer had this certain situation. Oh, this territory had this special case, and our NPS score is not that good, but it's one time. It's a lot of dispute. So I'm not sure whether it's a good, effective way to do that. But to your point, David, I think I always believe compensation plan is not a substitute for management. We have sales leaders, so we build a strong sales team, and then we do need leader to provide guidance, to make sure we balance out net new versus retention. that part is something we should always think about. It's all about context, and also sales team is all about a contest. So, you can have certain contest and to see like which group, which region, which team had a highest renewal rate or non-renewal rate, something like to add on to that, just spice that up. Could be a spiff, could be something else, and to just boost out. Other than that, I think I agree with Vincent and Christina. Their proposal suggestions should work out well, and I've used that in the past.
And I'll
David,
just add on. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
I'll go then. David, I thought it was interesting, and I think Renee in the chat mentioned NPS, or Net Promoter Score. For those of us that maybe have started our actual professional career in maybe say retail, for example, right? Cash register, store management, whatever it may be. If you remember back in the day, the receipts would print and it'd say, call this number or do this online survey and rate us a 5 out of 5, right? And just kind of think about back in those days, actually working that day to day and how aggressive some of the frontline employees may be to get that perfect score. And then fast forward, consulting with a retail company, and they wanted to include that. And it was a perfect opportunity for me to provide real life experience to say, hey, you do need to think about the repercussions at the store level, right? Because a store could have, or a retail location could have a perfect 10 out of 10 NPS score, but are they driving away customer count, right? So coming back to like that balanced approach, maybe it's store revenue, maybe it's amount of market share, or maybe prescriptions, and if you're in the pharmacy retail, versus just an NPS score really driving that incentive, right? So it's just kind of interesting bring that up there.
Christina?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to the points around the NPS score as well. So I historically, when I've seen that done, it's typically been in the form of some sort of like MBO. So some sort of, objective-based plan. It's typically in your customer success orgs, right? That they have something like that built in, and it's less a revenue generating target and more so like that customer sat, right? Score, kind of what that looks like. So that's where I've seen that implemented in the past. And I agree with Pauline's point, there does typically tend to be disputes. But most commonly when these comp plans are administered, they're usually towards some sort of revenue target or bookings target, depending on your business and what's the best fit for you. So definitely not a common measure, but I've seen it implemented in past roles.
Yeah, no, and I feel like all three of you have echoed kind of a similar thing. I think we agree on this one, that the NPS I found generates disputes. Also, very hard to set a baseline. You really have to convince reps what their baseline is. You have to show them the metric well before you start compensating them on it. And it can be very, very noisy, and ultimately probably not what you want to do. If you train, I think in that kind of area, of what I've seen best is if you train your reps really well, and you're training them to listen to the customer's voice, then you probably don't need an actual comp measurement on it. But every organization is different. Okay, I guess I might move on to the third scenario for everyone. And this one, we've set this up a little bit less like an actual scenario, and we just wanted to go through a bunch of different examples of kind of gaming loopholes. And I know this came up, I think, on the call briefly yesterday in the nudge session. And there was a little bit of chatter about it in the chat window by some guests. So curious if we'll probably revisit a little bit, but examples of gaming loopholes that we have here, certainly not an exhaustive list, but some examples: splitting single deals into multiple smaller ones to meet multiple sales targets or quotas, pushing to close deals early or late in a evaluation period to maximize accelerators, which potentially neglect the quality or suitability for the customer. Reps using excessive discounting to close deals quickly and boost volume, even when discounts aren't necessary. Canceling existing contracts, reselling the same product or service to the same customer to count as a new sale. Probably a little fairly obvious unethical one there. But I guess these are 4 examples. Have you seen incentive systems designed in a way that's advantageous to the business when gained by the reps? And also, can we design comp plans that are fair and difficult to exploit in your experience?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one first. So my thoughts when I look at this, I'll touch on, I'll just kind of touch on a couple of the points. So the last one specifically stands out with, canceling the contracts and reselling same product. Ways that I would recommend looking into this one is having a clause built into your terms and conditions, right? Like there's typically some sort of condition in there that states like if the customer basically purchases the exact same product portfolio within X number of days or months right after a contract is canceled or not renewed, right, whatever that looks like in the system, then it would not be eligible for quote unquote new business, because the system picks that up in a way of saying like this was just canceled or not renewed. Like the customer's not purchasing anything new, they're simply purchasing something that they already had within that window of time. And then when you look at the pulling deals in from future periods, there's a couple of ways to look at that. I think it is beneficial to the business in some extent, but also most T's and C's will have something along the lines of like a compensation audit process or evaluation process for high attainment. So things that you have to kind of consider when you're doing that is if you're pulling that in from a future fiscal, it may not be factored into the goal, right? So for the seller, they could get caught in comp assurance or, audit process, and then that could be buffered down via a decelerated rate calculation. It can impact quite a few things. So I think the key to that is setting the expectations in the beginning, right? Making sure your T's and C's are clear on what behaviors will and won't be allowed. And then what are the business's protective measures, right? Like what happens if these big deals get pulled in and attainment skyrockets? Like, do you just kind of consume that additional expense? Do you have something in place that you can implement to try to control that behavior if it's not a desired behavior? I think some of these, there's pros and cons, like I said, like the pull-in one, but depending on what's happening and if that's a behavior the business wants to incentivize would depend on how you handle that situation.
Yeah, I totally agree. T's and C's is certainly the one of the first things came to my mind. A lot of things we need to set a boundary, and that's clearly stated what's encouraged, what's ethical, what's not. So those should be very clearly mentioned in the terms and conditions. So pull in and push out, it's a little bit tricky. Sometimes public companies, they want to go their route at the quarter end to make sure, they meet a target, or they overkilled for this quarter. They want to have some reserve for next quarter. So it can be tricky. So a company has to balance it out in terms of a financial book. So there must be strategy, policy needs to be set in place ahead of the time. So there's no ambiguity and know what should be done, what should not be done. In terms of pricing and discount deals, etc., breaking big deal to small deals, I implemented one thing which is called deal scores. So I had an extra kicker for a discount grid for deal size and for multi-year contract. So those are the ways you can use to encourage, incentivize, the deal size, the multi-year contract, and then not giving heavy discount. So that can be factored in the comp plan, considered as a deal scores to serve as a funding factor or extra kicker, and that actually worked quite well. So there are ways to do that, and also, I think for most companies, we do like to encourage and incentivize sales at the beginning of the year, because a lot of deals gets pushed to the second half of years. It's like a common pattern. So if you want to do that to achieve that goal, you can have some quarterly kicker or quarterly attainment multiply for Q1, Q2 to make sure deals can come in at the beginning of the year rather than at the end of the year.
Awesome, and I agree with Christina and Pauline in that I feel like there's gaming throughout the entire fiscal year, right? But I think it kind of kicks up a notch. I think Pauline mentioned kind of on the second half. I always kind of have seen a lot of the reps kind of try to figure out the quota setting process, right? Where is that data being collected? When is it being collected? How is it being collected? And how could they manipulate maybe their current pipeline or forecasting, or to the speaker's point, closing the deals before or after a certain period of time to set them up for success the following fiscal year, right? So again, kind of reiterating that the tightening of the governance, T's and C's, scenarios, trying to keep the field in check there, but then also make sure there's enough validation checks and reviews before administering compensation.
Right. I guess in your experience for all three of you, how do you typically hear about these cases of gaming? Is it typically come up through some sort of analysis that your teams are working on, like a retrospective at the end of the year, or is it typically something that bubbles up out of the region in Chicago? So-and-so sold this deal. Hey, should we rethink how we're crediting these sales? I'm curious.
The best approach. The best approach, I think, is to have spies in the field for you. But I'm just kidding. No, I think for those of us that handle kind of the comp committee exception review process, that starts to kind of bubble things up, right? And you start to see kind of themes and identify certain trends. And as you kind of probe and peel back the layers a little bit, you start to understand how they're starting to game the plan. Sorry, Christine, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're totally fine. Yeah, I agree. Spies are the best decision here. Somebody reports back to you. No. But yeah, so great call outs, Vince. So what I would say on this is a couple of things, right? Like I've seen it come up a couple of ways. Obviously, yeah, like some sort of audit process, right? High attainment. If something's getting pulled in that's massive, that was not factored into the baseline when goals were set to begin with. Naturally, that's going to show up, right? Because we're going to question like, hey, why is that so high? Like Vince said, you start peeling back the layers, you start kind of seeing what happened. If it's not just like a net new, like just deal we just really didn't expect, it's something that came in early. And then in prior situations, there's been instances where like a dispute's open about not getting paid on something. And when you start looking into what happened with that deal, you start to notice that the behavior behind the deal execution was not ideal. And it was one of those situations captured in the T's and C's that called out they would not receive compensation on it, and the system caught that in the process. Hence, they were not paid commission on that deal because of that. So it really depends on kind of what's happening, but those are usually the two places. It's usually some sort of commission dispute around like their crediting or some sort of compensation assurance audit process. Yeah.
Right. I've always seen what companies do really well is that if you're doing a retrospective on what does a good rep look like, that's what I've kind of always seen it termed of what does a good rep look like by the end of the year. And if you're doing an analysis and computing different metrics, like, yeah, what's their average, the gross margin on their deals? What's the, how many deals are they selling compared to the average? And if you're kind of separating, you're taking a cohort of reps that are widespread, different geographies, different types, and trying to figure out what are they doing well. If you can do that analysis and figure out that they're doing things you don't want them to do, that's also another great start, other than, perhaps, yes, like these onesie twosies that come in through the year that really set off the alarm bell. So I think I've always found those are the two, what you guys were mentioning, those are the two best ways to mitigate against it. All right, so we've finished gaming activities. I will move one slide further. And now we're going to focus on unfair territories and quotas. And so we'll split this into two, but essentially there's territory bias that we've kind of highlighted, that territories that don't adequately balance customer potential and sales opportunity, plans and territories that reward long tenured reps to build their business and coast, and then also competition overlap between territories. Those are a few examples of what we deem territory bias. And then on the other side, examples of quota unfairness is, quotas are set based off of historical growth and don't account for potential, quotas that don't account for seasonal fluctuations, And also sometimes we've encountered this where there's one size fits all quotas that just don't factor in any nuances at all, and ultimately result in kind of, wacky quotas across the geographies. And so for the panel, I wanted to ask, what are some best practices that you've seen for keeping territories and quotas balanced, and what data and analytics help accomplish this?
Yeah, I can, I'll kick this one off. So looking at territory, I'll start there. So I think the key to this is, to your point, like you talked on the last topic, right? Some proactive monitoring done during the coverage setting process, right? So really looking at your historical performance in those territories, right? Like, are there bookings being generated in that? Is there forecasts, right, for in those territories for future fiscals? And if there's not, then the question kind of becomes, why do we have headcount allocated to territories where we don't see potential, right? And I think it's really working with your sales leaders who do know their business best to dive into those conversations as you're doing those coverage setting activities. So having that data around like bookings potential, historical, coverage data, like did we have people there in prior fiscals, right? Having that forecast or pipeline built in there as well to see what the potential is, also to help with headcount allocation, right? Do we need one? Do we need two? How many people do we need covering those territories? I think making that territory exercise more of a mathematical exercise in a sense, to some extent, right? Is definitely important, along with your go-to-market, right? Like depending on your comp plan, some are not full portfolio, some are product specific, right? So you really have to get into what is the needs of the business, what is your go-to-market strategy, what is your bookings potential for those territories, and how many heads do you need there? So it really becomes a much larger exercise than just kind of putting people in places, right? So I think when we look at it with all of those factors, it tends to set us up for success in regards to territory alignment. That's my perspective and kind of what I've seen. On the quota side, this one is, quota setting and territories are always a hot topic, and they tend to be a very tense topic depending on who you're discussing with. But my perspective is it's a joint effort, right? It's a tops down, right? We're all naturally given an overarching number that we need to go and hit, but it's also a bottoms up. We need to leverage our stakeholders and our leaders, again, that know that business best, right? Like what is repeatable business, what is not, what were windfalls that we don't anticipate repeating for another 2, 3, 4 fiscals, right? Like these are all things that need to go into that goal setting process to ensure that we have, a fair distribution when everything kind of comes together, right? When those territories and the goals and the comp plans come out, these are all pieces of the puzzle that we should be evaluating.
I think, as Christina mentioned, a lot of the quantitative type items to keep in mind. I think from a qualitative perspective, territories, what I've seen in my past has been a defined rules of engagement, right? So as your reps are out there, whether it's domestic or global or whatever it may be, whatever vertical as well, put forth how do you want them to engage? And that could be all the way to partnering on a deal for splits, maybe some type of handoff from an account or from a hunter to an account manager, whatever it may be, but at least you have something as more of a guideline versus kind of like a Wild Wild West approach there. On the quota side, this would probably be more of a inside or operational type focus, but how do you as an organization want to handle quota adjustments? It's inevitable, right? I think for all of us that rolled out quotas, there's always some type of change, whatever it may be, but do you want to put in a minimum threshold by an individual, by a territory, book of business? What is justifiable within the reps control? What is outside the reps control? If you put a lot of thought and proactive planning on that, as it will come up and inevitably, then you have some, again, a playbook to go about handling that. So just some food for thought on those 2 items.
Yeah, thanks. I think we just mentioned two most important documents and policies, ROE and the terms and conditions, and these two we can never spend enough time on that because there will always be different business scenario situation. We have to constantly update according to the go-to-market strategy, etc. So definitely something we should constantly revisit and then make sure it's up to date. So territory and the quotas, they can definitely be heated conversations. So one way to do is to make sure be proactive and really work with the sales leaders ahead of time. And Christina and Vincent mentioned in a different approach, like top down, bottom up, definitely is one way to go by. And I think really to be successful, really have to build very good trust, a strong relationship with the sales leader and finance team as well to work together, make sure the company goals is being met, and the exercise shows the reasonable result. I think what I've done in the past and the most is a one size fits all by region, by segment, SMB, mid-market, key accounts, but a different region has different quota. So seems like it worked out better than individual ones, unless there are special pilot program, etc. That would be different.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's funny because this slide makes it seem, Pauline, to your point, that one size fits all is a bad thing, but there are examples when it actually is fine, right? Like if you have completely untapped potential across your entire sales force, I mean, it is definitely not a crazy idea to roll something like that. One thing you did mention though, Pauline, I wanted to expand a little upon is you mentioned the word trust, and I going back to what Vince and Christina also talked about in terms of the methodology of quota setting. I'm curious in your experiences, how much do you find companies you've worked at have kind of been completely transparent about that methodology and explained and taught the sales force? Because essentially when I receive a quota, if I'm a rep, there's a lot of how the heck did this number come together, right? And so how much education do you guys do in your experience of telling them that math, Christina, that you mentioned as well, right?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think I've seen this vary at different organizations, right? I think at every organization, the consistent piece is we try to make sure they at least have a general understanding, right? I think in most cases, if we try to go into all of the nuances that go into goal setting, the sellers may just totally doze off and go to sleep in the middle of the conversation. There's a lot of moving pieces that go into goal setting, but the key things, I think, to your point, that they want to be aware of are what are things that they can help monitor for and be aware of and make sense of. And so in most organizations I've been at, yeah, right, like we're pretty transparent around like all of the factors that go into goal setting and how we derived at the number. But in most cases too, the sales leader is also involved to some extent. So there is some expectation that the sales leader help partner with their teams and help make sure they understand as well. But between the collective group, yeah, right, we do try to make sure they understand because it's important, right? We want sellers to feel like the target they've been given is achievable. It's a well thought out target. It's not just, we all sat down at a table and put some numbers out there and the one that sounded good, we rolled with it. So I think it's important for them to understand and fully, be bought into the logic, right? Because I think it helps support the motion when they do feel like they were given an adequately, fair thought out target. Yeah.
Right. And just to push further, do you roll out? Do you guys roll out documents explaining the methodology? Is it done at more of a region level, or is it manager led that explains the methodology? What does it actually look like in practice?
If that was for me, no, there's no documentation that gets rolled out, right? It's typically more of a high level conversation when you're having your comp plan rollout sessions at the beginning of a fiscal year, right? You're discussing the comp plan. The question that inevitably comes up is, okay, well, how are targets being derived? And typically it's a partnership between the comp team and the finance team or whomever in your organization owns the goal setting process to help shed some light on the thought process that went into it. But I have not seen it where a documentation has been provided. I don't know, Vince or Pauline, if you have, but that is not standard practice in my experience.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Pauline.
Okay. Okay, so thanks. So we did some kind of a Google sheet to show, the company goal by region, by segment, and there's input data and there's outcome result, how we should distribute a quota, and how to, of course, before quota the territory. So, and then share with the leaders, and they can review, and we even share, with different regions, so they can mimic the methodology. So something like that we used. The other thing is we also had a policy in terms of quota relief, because that seems to be a hot topic. What happens if, let's say there's a COVID-24, whatever, right? What happens if for like a retention, the customer cancel the contract or ran out of business or got bought? So we had a document for quota relief and list all those different scenarios. So it's kind of a being proactive again to make sure we consider business what if scenarios ahead of time and list them out. So when there's scenarios fits like 1, 2, 3, and we know how we will treat everyone fairly and consistently.
And Vince, did you want to weigh in there as well?
Like out there, I believe the transparency on kind of quota setting process. And in my experience, I've seen the wide range, right? From a black box to full transparency. There was no one right way to manage it, because you're always going to have an issue arise out of it, right? I actually kind of view it slightly different. Yes, you want to kind of share some transparency. I think what Christina mentioned, kind of high level. But you also got to think operationally, it is not scalable, right? You think about how many FTEs you have on the back end to support X number of payees on the front end. No one can take that time to walk through every single account, book of business, product, whatever it may be, to make a rep feel comfortable, right? So like a lot of things that we do within sales commissions and compensation is that we want to empower the leadership team, right? We want to make sure that they are knowledgeable and they understand the process, and then they can then sit down through their coaching sessions with their payees and direct reports once they roll out the plans, right? It's kind of like spreading the wealth and make sure that everyone is buying into the philosophy together. And it's not just a corporate or sales operation, sales strategy, planning, whatever team driving it.
Yeah, one thing
Sorry,
go ahead, Pauline.
No, I say I like that a lot, and we actually also do that. Make sure like they know they are the owners, right? They are not being assigned based on company strategy and the target. They are the owner. They are going to meet those goals, and they find their creative way to meet the goals.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that another practice that I feel is best in class is to, in terms of focusing specifically on quota fairness, because it's such a hot topic, is that you have to show everyone that you are doing the rigorous work to test the fairness. And what I mean by that is using that methodology of how you're setting quotas and simulating a year. And so what I mean by that is what I typically see is you use data from a couple of years ago, use the methodology you're going to roll out, and set quotas for the previous year, and then use the actual sales you got in that previous year to then measure your attainments. And so you can then carve that data up and think about fairness in a different way. Oh, I'm going to look at high share territories versus low share territories. Do they perform on average kind of the same? You can look at different regions. You can look at the tenure of rep. Do long tenured reps do just as well as short tenured reps? And ultimately what we're trying to get a sense of is that, does everyone have a fair shot to get on average a similar attainment? Of course, there's going to be fluctuations, but if you can show and convince what you guys have mentioned, that manager layer, that it's not just, we're not just being open about the methodology. We've tested this a lot, and we've seen pretty fair results in our simulations. Then I think you get that buy-in that you crave. So I'm just in the interest of time, I know we have 9 minutes left. It's been a great discussion. We have one more case study that I want to get your thoughts on. So I'll go through it briefly. So the situation here, this is around upside down budgets and kind of when your budgeting doesn't accurately predict the future outcome. So essentially a company in this scenario underwent a large change in their Salesforce structure, and they created several new roles. And these new roles required revamping the existing quota setting process, in addition to updating objectives, components, OTU weights, everything. And so the company had been using the same payout curve for the past decade. And given all the new roles had still attainment-based objectives, they said, let's just keep this one going forward. And when they ended up finishing the year, they noticed that they did really well in terms of meeting attainment. They came in right on target at 100%, but their comp spend exceeded budget by 25%. So they came in at 125% to budget. And so I guess the questions for the group is, how can companies optimize their comp budgeting process to predict reliable results? And what modern day systems, methodologies do you guys use, and what data do you use to get this right?
I'll go first if anybody else wants to. So, yeah. So my recommendation on this one is there's a couple ways to look at it, right? So when I try to look at spend, like comp spend, you first and foremost, you need to look at headcount, right? Your headcount plans. You need to look at your attainment bands, right? Your accelerators and those bands, and try to do that modeling around, the amount of heads you have, the average attainment, those sellers had in prior fiscal. So like what percent of your sales force was at 100, 150, whatever the bands are within your plan, and then utilize, your average variable or TI amount, right? To try to then evaluate your average comp spend. I also would typically recommend a mid-year true up, right? Like, so we know we can make so many predictions, but as you said, like if the plan's new, if we have new areas, new verticals, it really just depends. We need to kind of plug those in mid-year and rerun that simulation to see, are we on target? Are we higher than expected? Are we lower than expected? Because all of these things are important. Some people may look at lower and go, this is great, we're saving money. But if you're lower, then does that mean your attainment's lower? Does that mean the plans aren't performing like we thought they should be? So in general, a mid-year evaluation on that spend is important for multiple reasons. A, are we kind of on par? There are other ways to look at that as well, but this is one way. And then B, to true up that commission expense or that commission rate that's been rolled up to the finance source, they can true up accordingly as well. So I think when you take all of those factors and plug that in, you can try to get a reasonable prediction of if you're going to be over, under, or right on target and handle that as you need to. In regards to systems, I think there are quite a few systems out there these days that can help with that. When I've facilitated this in prior roles, it's been Excel spreadsheets. So that wasn't probably the most efficient way to do it. But I know, Vince, you're the systems guru here, so I'm sure you have some great tips there on how this can be done more efficiently than in spreadsheets.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. Actually, so I was going to add that point there. Maybe it's what I've done in the past, or maybe I'm old school or something like that. But if you have a SPM solution in place today, most likely you have a production environment and sandbox environment, maybe more, right? But then 10 to that is to have your production environment replicate in your sandbox environment. So you have all the up-to-date participant information, components, even attainment, orders, credits, whatever it may be, as you're looking to do, and it could either be like a Monte Carlo type situation or maybe predefined levers that you're going to be tweaking. Rate tables, assume 70% hit the target or 85%, whatever it may be. You can actually do that forecasting within your sandbox environment, actually to minimize kind of the level of effort, right? For those that play in spreadsheets or G sheets, leverage your system. I mean, that's what you're paying for, right? That's part of your ROI, essentially, to support either your plan design process or other internal stakeholders.
Well, formal AI can do that for us, right? I'm not sure whether there's any FP&A person here, and I will chime in. Christina mentioned that I will hold FP&A responsible first. Just kidding, but it's a collaborative effort, a joint project. But definitely, how we set a budget what assumption do we use is really important. A lot of company, they say, we don't know how to forecast commission payout. We just assume 100% attainment, 100% OTV on target variables. That's the budget. But in reality, I think we need to work with, rev ops, go-to-market, rev team, to and especially when it comes down to quota setting, we just talk about what is the assumption we actually are using for quota attainment. We assume like average is 80%, or we assume average is 75%. That actually really helps to set a budget as well, because you factor that majority in the bell curve, then you factor in the overperformance side, right? The outperformance, what kind of accelerators you can kick in. A lot of companies, finance team, they will say, we don't know how to predict. We just use 100% OTV. That itself may not be the best base, and that can cause a budget issue. The other thing is I always ask for a commission rate, because I can go have a pay commission 30% above budget, but the revenue, the sales volume is 600% above budget. So it's a good problem for everyone. It's a celebration rather than a problem-solving situation, right? So a base commission rate at a company level serve the purpose. This is the budget, but if we had a super great year and the commissions went up 20%, 30% above budget, but that is still great, and we still have good P&L. So those are the scenarios we should factor in to have a base to work with. Then we can do variance analysis, make sure we are actually really on good track or not.
Yeah, and I think you guys have raised great points. The two main takeaways that you guys have said for me is that combination of, Christina's mentioning, it's all about, and Vince, you mentioned it too, about the shape of the curve, Monte Carlo, or Christina, you mentioning looking at the distribution, because if you just use an average attainment and an average OTE, you're not going to capture those tails of the distribution curve that do sway the spend quite a bit, right? And if you have a sandbox environment and you can utilize this kind of analysis, it is extremely helpful in getting it right. And then I think the second point that you guys mentioned as well is that it's not even about predicting necessarily. It's about bookending the solution and saying, we are at 95% attainment. Based on our simulations, this is where we're going to finish the year in terms of total spend. We're not saying we necessarily are going to keep this pace to 95%, but we've already given you, if we get back to 100%, what the spend's going to be, because we've modeled it and we've done the work. So I think those are excellent points. I know we're coming up on time. I wanted to thank the three of you, Vince, Christina, and Pauline, for joining today. It's been a great discussion. And, I've seen the chat. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to participate in the chat as much, but great to see all the questions and lively debate. And thank you again for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.